Hello. Thank you so much for joining us to Seattle Council PTSA DEI meeting. And I want to share this resource because DEI is the heart and thread of PTA. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I would like to acknowledge that it is Indigenous Peoples Day, but we are going to start with the next slide, which is about interpretations. So I am going to replay the interpretations for those who may need it right now.
So I want to offer a land acknowledgement on this day. We acknowledge that the city of Seattle is on stolen Coast Salish land, specifically the ancestral land of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and Muckleshoot people. We recognize the stewardship of Seattle by the Coast Salish people since time immemorial. The disruption of this work by colonization and now endeavor to continue this work. I also want to acknowledge that the honor of the namesake of our city is Chief Seal, a Duwamish and Suquamish ancestor. I would also like to acknowledge the labor of our people, that we remember that this country is built on the labor of people who were enslaved, people who were kidnapped and brought to the U.S. from the African continent, and recognize the continued contribution of the survivors. We also want to acknowledge all immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, or undocumented people who contributed to the building of this country and continue to serve within our labor force. I also want to acknowledge the unpaid care labor that is given to our people. And so I want to acknowledge and thank you so much for everybody and how you are serving in the community. This is the immeasurable work of their descendants, and we acknowledge all of their indomitable work in the space that we gather today. It is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate these histories, to repair harm, and to honor and protect and sustain this land. And I'd like to acknowledge that our PTA theme for reflections this year is I Belong. So thank you. We all belong in this space. I also want to give a little shout out to the history of PTA, and this is part of the work that we have to do in carrying the message as PTA ambassadors in our communities. That PTA was started with Alice McEllen Burney and Phoebe Apperson Hurst, who from the women's movement also advocated for on behalf of children and all children in the community so that they had a right to public education. And it's through that from the National Congress of Mothers that they expanded into the national and joining in with the National Congress of Parent Teachers and the National Congress of Colored Parents and Teachers, founded by Selena Sloan Butler in Atlanta, Georgia. And one of the things that we say that Selena says is that Black families can only advocate for Black children. And so when we also acknowledge that space, I like to acknowledge that when I go into PTA, I like to ask and not assume, right? So I hope that if there's one thing that we all carry from this meeting is that asking and not assuming. And so I just want to acknowledge that we are a part of Washington State PTA, and they received the Outstanding State PTA Advocacy Award. And I will share these slides afterwards so that you all know that you are a part of a greater community, that as Seattle advocates, that we work together in conjunction with Washington State PTA. And Seattle Council PTSA. We also have the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Award in 2021, and that we continue this work in our breath. So thank you so much for joining us in this place. So today I'm going to start the meeting with the DEI audit. I have to say that I was a PTA, a pandemic PTA person. And so when I came to enjoy the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I felt like I was scrambling to find resources within the city, within my Full Sail community. But it wasn't until I came to Seattle Council PTSA that I realized that National PTA already has all the work for us. So you do not have to reinvent the wheel, and that I want to show that we have a full scale community here. So I invited JAMS PTSA Equity Committee, Jennifer Tsunami, to show up for this meeting today to help share their experiences and how they were able to build their PTA community in alignment to what the diversity, equity, inclusion statements have. So for those who might not know, there is a National PTA Resource Guide, and on that page, There are commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's also available in Spanish for our communities too. And that we have a local leader guide for diversity, equity, inclusion. So that is all on the National PTA space. And the most important thing that I want to do for the beginning of the year is talk about the DEI community profile template. So in the DEI community profile template, it is to ask in our community who makes up our community, what languages are spoken, how do our families look like. Some families have grandparents, some children are foster kids, some kids are divorced, some people might have two mothers. And so I just want to say that we want to look and examine at our whole scale community and making sure that that is included in our community. And so when I went to the JAMS PTSA meeting to help support them in their grounding, I really valued that they took a lot of that work into that space. So Jennifer, would you like to talk and about how that it was really, really intentional in your work and that it wasn't built in a day, that it took years of work for that?
Yeah, so the equity team at JAMS is something that's been built over many years, and many different boards have come through. And so that's something I definitely want to acknowledge from the start, which is that you need somebody to get the ball rolling, but then you have to have methods by which you can sustain the work and pass it along, especially when we're talking about having parents who are coming. You're going to have parents who are rotating through the system. So you can't assume that every group that comes after you is going to know the history, or that they're going to have the same ideas of how the work is supposed to be done. And so part of what we were trying to do is figure out ways to pass along our learning from previous board members, from previous people who had worked on the work, how to bring everybody on the same page about what the values were that we were trying to do with our equity work, and then how do we pass that information along to future PTSAs, board members, and community members. So one of the things that we were doing was this board grounding, in which we actually had help from the Office of the Education Ombuds. Jordana Scribanek was our moderator. She was our presenter who talked us through many of the equity principles that we were trying to communicate to our board.
Oh, pause, Jennifer. We just slow down for interpreters. So
Sorry.
that's okay. I know it's hard in this space, but yeah. I'm a fast talker too, so I'm trying to be intentional. So this is June, and also for the interpreters, for our ASL interpreters, it's important to say our name first too. So I totally forgot about that too.
I'm a little nervous.
It's okay.
Yes, I'm Jennifer Tsunami, and I will try to slow down.
We just appreciate any effort. But so you brought in Jordanis.
Yes, and what we were hoping to do is, we do have an equity resolution, which was created based off of actually information from the SCPTSA. They have a template available that we originally based it off of, but that work was done 5 years ago. And we felt like we wanted to be able to talk about what was working from the resolution and what things maybe would be more, that we could update and make them more useful. But we needed to have everybody in the same place before we started the work. And we also thought this was an opportunity for us to get to know each other better, to build the kind of trust that we would need to work on these issues as a community.
Yeah, because that's the one thing that I noticed at JAMS, the JAMS community is that, and I also want to recognize this working in the full-scale community is that our communities are so rich in our multiculturalism. It is so rich in our perspective, and it is so rich in learning from each other. So I know that for me, sorry, this is June again. I know that for me, I am learning in so many different spaces, and I know that, ableism is a blind spot for me. And so I am trying to work and exercise that muscle. And so, do you want to talk about working those muscles and realizing what it is when you make mistakes or when we can try and do better next time?
Yes, so this is Jennifer again. So one of the challenges that we have on our board is that we have members who cannot attend meetings in person. And that has been something which we struggle, technology can be a struggle. And that is something which, though, has been very important for us to be intentional about, that we have the ability to make sure that everybody is feeling fully included in the spaces that we're creating for our meetings. And it's something, it's been a challenge, and so we are still struggling with aspects of it. We're struggling with some of the technical aspects. We're struggling with making sure that people feel comfortable in the way that they're interacting. If, for instance, if everybody's not in the room, that we're interacting in a way that feels comfortable for people on both sides of the screen, basically, and making sure that everyone feels included in that way. And then translation has been another ongoing challenge, making sure that we are providing that we are reaching out and letting people know that these resources are available, and that we are working to provide them so that they feel comfortable coming and being included in our meetings. And that continues to be a challenge. It's something that we are aware that a lot of it's going to be relationship building, is going to be how we can address some of those issues that we've had. And the disability justice principles that we were talking about in the meeting, we were talking about intersectionality is something I think a lot of people hear about, but it's really good to be reminded that our work as a PTSA is also about addressing whole people in our community, and that intersectionality is a really big part of seeing that sometimes advocacy in some areas can actually be hurtful, because it asks people to split their identities in ways that can be very painful. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing to make sure that we are providing ways for people to show up in the fullness of their selves, if that makes sense. And another thing is that making sure that when we are talking about these issues and challenges, that we are letting the people who are the most impacted by them have the greatest say in how we are addressing them. And that, I think, is a really important point that is also quite challenging, because you have to kind of create the space first to have people feel safe coming in and taking these and then you have to have actual giving people the leadership positions so they can talk about and bring forth the things that they need, as opposed to just coming up with solutions that we think work best.
Okay, let me
Outside the communities that we were trying to address.
Thank you. I just want to pause for a second to address our Somali interpreter. So I'm going to pause the recording. This is June. Sorry. Thank you. I am resuming the recording. Yes, thank you so much. Where there was just a confusion, but I wanted to say, um, what what do you feel like, especially I feel like with hybrid as well, um, it honors just everyone's different capacity, whether or not you are, or, and how you show up. We are all working families, right? We're all working in order to be in Seattle. and work shows up in different ways. And so I feel like too, when we honor whether or not we create a space of having childcare, like one of the things that I thought was really amazing about your meeting was that you guys provided food and that
Mhm.
children were welcome and that hybrid was part of your meeting. Um, and I know that sometimes I know that too, for me, that can be also a blind spot of how we show up and making sure that people feel welcome in this space. Is there something that you'd like to add? Like, what is the struggle or what is the barrier in that?
I think a lot of it is just there's so many pieces. It can be hard to remember um, all the different things that we may need to address or the um, questions we need to ask. We've been working on actually an equity checklist to help us as we're planning events or activities or thinking about initiatives that we want to launch, just to give us a way to remind ourselves of the kinds of questions that we should be asking about accessibility, about who in the community that we're serving, things like that. And another thing that we're trying to do is get a better handle on our demographics, just so we just have a better idea of who in the community we are reaching and who we might be missing. Because when you can see the the student makeup, the body student body makeup, it gives you an idea of, oh, there are these groups or these students that we are leaving behind, because you can see that you perhaps are not having them come to events or things like that. So I think those, it doesn't capture everything, but those are methods that we can use to sort of just help us.
Yes,
Um,
and that intention is intention work, right?
yeah.
And I think some people ask, like, well, how am I supposed, sorry, this is June. I think um, also we ask ourselves in the community, like, we see different things, but we can assume different things unless and those two things might not match. And so it is really, really important to have a partnership with the administration, right, to figure out
Mhm.
what languages that we're speaking. I was really impressed that my first email, like I got an email from our science teacher, and it was in 4 different languages. And I think that is another thing that I heard from another PTA, where when we are writing out information to our full-scale community, that to write English very plainly, no flowery languages, so that it can interpret easier if you don't have the capacity to pay for a translator in your PTA. I also want to say that for those in the community who have Amharic, Somali, or Vietnamese families, we do have a template at Seattle Council PTSA for membership. So if that was thoughtfully given to us by Emerson PTA, and so we can share that resource. But if we want to build more resources in the community, like maybe there's more Chinese speakers in your community, or maybe there's more Amharic speakers in the community, um, it's different based upon where we are in Seattle. Another thing that I heard too from another PTA community is that a lot of the parents sometimes don't feel welcome in that space
Mhm.
because um, it might not look different. It might look differently from how they grew up. They might have grown up in a different country. And so I remember having an Asian family telling me, like, why do we do all this stuff for kids? And, and I acknowledge that she was from Japan. And it's like, oh, yeah, you guys all, the children participate more and it is expected of that participation. So it culturally looks differently to all our different households. So I also want to acknowledge that. But so the PTA school that had a very diverse community for their after school program, the community social worker had like a language sharing space. And so that was able to convert a lot of their Spanish and Chinese speakers in their community and Vietnamese community to showing up, seeing their children, feeling welcome. I know that in the past too, there was another PTA group where the Somali mothers were looking for a space to show up and the librarian needed some help. And so that was another advocacy opportunity and volunteer opportunity for them to show up in that space. Um, Does anyone have any questions right now before I move to volunteering? But I wanted to see if, especially because I see a lot of our DEI leaders in this space and PTA presidents in this space, I'm going to ask you to come on.
I have a lot of questions,
Mhm.
but I'm really curious of like how really to implement this. The current PTA that I am a co-president to, um, it very much looks like the haves and the have-nots in the way of the past PTA has been more of the affluent families in the school, and we have joined this current year as with co leadership, but that has not been happening well, um, if at all at times. And I think the biggest thing is the DEI perspective, as well as being inclusive of the great amount of diversity that our school has in so many different demographics, some that I'm sure that I am not even aware of. Um, and I guess my question is like how does one stay at peace and wanting to give the good fight and keep continuing? Because, as we all know, being a part of the PTA is a extra thing that the whoever this adult is in this child's life has chosen to do. And um
and has the capacity to do.
and has the capacity. And we're in October, and my capacity box is already dwindling in ways because it's very frustrating and disturbing on the other hand of the lack of a continuity, the lack of like wanting to like be inclusive of families. And I'm just curious, like what I mean, I think it's I guess part of it's a personal question, right? But at the same time, it's I'm just curious or what should I be like what should my rebuttal be every time I face this? Like what should the things I say be? Or should I can't even say it correctly. Pardon me.
No.
I am dyslexic, and so it came out the opposite way of what I wanted. What are the words that I should be saying that are still trying to help center that this is for the children and this is not high school for us adults. This is not the good old days. We are in a new era, and
Mm-hmm.
our families truly need us, and they need us to be whole and as one, um, as well as recognizing that there's a lot of diversity. I hope I
Um,
was speaking slowly. I apologize if I was not, because I am a very fast talker.
This is June. Thank you so much, Penny Marie. I understand that that challenge, especially in Seattle, is that sometimes we have to talk about the class issue sometimes. And I think that is very, very recognizable that people of color can be of a certain class. And so sometimes we have to be able to acknowledge that the resources that we have is not only finding value in much money that we have, but the time in our heart. And so, like, I always like to say that we in Seattle are culturally rich, right? We may not be monetarily rich, but if we give and share our abundance and show up for each other, that is a real plus. One of the things about PTA is actually to facilitate the space of bringing voices together. And sometimes that can be very, very challenging. I think sometimes we think that it is a binary, like team sports, like go blue team versus green team. Or I know that um, I've heard a family tell to me that they felt like going up to PTA felt like, what sorority do I need to join? Right. And so it can feel really, really
Exactly.
icky.
Exactly that. Pardon me to interrupt. This is right, but that is exactly what it feels like. And it's very gross and it is emotionally exhausting at this point. And again, we're in October. You're
yes.
absolutely correct too.
I feel you. And so the DEI Facilitator's Guide, too, is about creating a listening space, right? There is a reason why we have 2-minute And it is supposed to be also reflective of our institution. No one likes Robert's rules, right? But that is how our legislators speak, right? And so when we're speaking to legislators, we have to realize that this state is very diverse, right? And so when we're talking about, you know, the many different conversations about challenging the progressive tax or challenging levies or figuring out how to be inclusive and finding the resources so that our families who speak a different language can feel authentic in their own selves and challenge, because a lot of us come from cultures that don't challenge authority, right? But we can challenge and change the status quo together. So I want to point out to the Enhancing DEI Facilitators Guide on the website too, and you are more than welcome to email us at president@scptsa. I am the co-treasurer, but we can take this together too. But it is on the National PTA, and so maybe creating a listening session. I mean, I feel you, Penny Marie. I have been told by my PTA that why do I have to make it all about race all the time? Or why do I, I've had a lot of people challenge me in certain ways that I wasn't doing enough. And I want to say, Penny Marie, you are doing enough, okay? And I want to say that to everybody who is showing up here, that you are doing it enough, okay? So thank you. Thank you. And we are here to bring visibility to that space because we do acknowledge that a lot of our building leaders have a lot of capacity of time to show up, and we might not be able to show up exactly in the way that our previous leaders have, but that is okay. Sorry. Is there I get really I want to acknowledge a question in the chat.
Yes, I would love to take this offline because I really, I again, this is because the other part is they have not been using Robert's rules,
Mhm.
and that was very interesting to find out. And then they have challenged me on why we have to use it. And Robert's rules was came up out in the 1800s. It's definitely not a Penny Marie thing. I promise you that. Is what I've said.
Penny's rules.
Yeah, no, it is definitely not Penny Marie's. It was, if we all knew what Robert's rules were made for, because as a person of color, I have to know what I'm going into. And I had to research what is Robert's rules? Why is Robert's rules what it is? So really making sure that they are that they are abiding by that because most of them don't. The previous board does not know what to do. So I would love to have some more information about that too. Thank you again
Yes.
for your time.
You're welcome. I appreciate you and the way that you show up authentically for your community.
Yeah, I think it's raising a good point that, bureaucracy can cut many different ways, but we can use that as a tool to help us push through these kinds of roadblocks that people are throwing up. You say National PTA has, rules you're supposed to follow. State PTA has rules you're supposed to follow. SCPTSA is giving you information about how you're supposed to be in compliance. And these are all things that you can say, listen, we as a PTA are supposed to be doing this work. It's in our rules, it's in our bylaws. And then it's bureaucracy can be used to, for progress, but you can also use it to your advantage. And I think taking advantage of that sometimes is another way that you can have something to push back. So.
As this is June, I also want to acknowledge that so much in Black spaces that I've heard is that you have to use a master's tools to bring down the master's house, right? So I want to acknowledge the question in the chat. What strategies are available for better access to information? Love the sitter and food ideas for ideas. How do folks navigate emails versus sending hard copies home? It feels like sending notes home can be easier than emails for some folks, but on the other hand, we do want to be mindful of resources and using paper. Anyone balancing this in a useful way? This is June. I have to say that especially having simple, like when I acknowledged the four languages, that was the take home flyer that this elementary school PTA used simple plain English language and then divided in four, so it's front and back. And then they had like each little section. Sometimes having a QR code is great because, you know, Google Translate can be embedded into your website. Also, the best communication is through the administrators and the school. Unfortunately, people have to opt into PTA. We cannot take their information because of FERPA and privacy laws. So we have it's kind of like being a vampire, right? You have to be invited into that space. And so hopefully that is some other space. So sometimes having classroom parents or classroom connectors, right, is a really, really great space of, and we don't have to do everything at once. Sometimes it's like inviting someone to coffee. Sometimes it's the harvest parties that are showing up and how you show up as a chaperone. And it's sometimes showing up as a person. I want to acknowledge Warlina Wheeler has a question. Thank you, Warlina. If you could unmute.
Yes, I'll come on camera for one moment just so you all can see my face. I'm sorry, I'm driving. This is actually part of the question. So I'm gonna go back off camera. You answered the most part just with, I was gonna ask for ideas on how to make connections without, let me just speak for myself. I am traumatized from emails, and I'm also a volleyball mom, single mother, raising two Black girls. I also look out for other girls within the community, trying to build relationships at the school and bring in other parents of color because the school that I am co-chair at, I'm co-chair with a teacher there at Dunlap Elementary School. We're in an area where it's super diverse. So culturally, some of us don't have the capacity to even sit down and go through emails. We're ripping and running. Kids are involved in the activities, just a number of different things. So for me, it's hard I might miss emails and that sort of thing for a few days. So you did actually give me a suggestion to kind of volunteer as I haven't done this in a while, but classroom peering and what that may look like for different communities in the school as well, because it's the cultural piece and communication piece. There's some communities where it's harder to connect with, but I'm pretty much answering my own question because you gave good advice, but I'm maybe asking for advice where what would you think about inviting in the parents and communities that are a little bit harder to make connections with in as being classroom volunteers and that sort of thing so that they can feel a part of the community and then also I guess get an understanding that of how things are a little bit different from possibly where they come from, but what their kids are learning. And I'm just having a hard time with getting in a lot of people to want to be a part of the PTSA. I know I'm just rambling on, but I actually did have something else to say. It's hard, guys, just being a woman of color, being in one of the most diverse places in the country, if not the world, 98118. I am, I don't know, I just want us to all feel a part of it. And then also not have to worry about the fees, barriers. So even with volunteering, inviting in parents, some of our parents may have made mistakes a few years ago and aren't able to pass the check boxes that they have to get clearance to come into the school. So I see so many barriers. And this is, I mean, I'm not mentioning names, but a parent that 6 years ago or so had a DUI or something like that, made a mistake and not able to come in and volunteer. So as a PTA parent, part of PTSA, also advocating for families in the community, myself and my children, how can I help with parents that want to be involved but cannot because of these barriers that are put up?
Warlina, this is June. I want to acknowledge that and I want to thank you so much. 98118 is the most diverse zip code in the United States, and I had the pleasure of producing a block party for the Graham Street station for that community. And I think the hardest part too is also recognizing the barriers of how we show up, right? And there are certain spaces that we can show up in PTA. I think the district, because of its capacity levels, is also distinguishing different things. And so whenever I am at a crossroads at things, I always say ask, don't assume. So for that parent, for example, who might have a barrier because of a mistake that they made in the past, right? How do they want to show up? Like I know for our immigrant families, the concept of ICE terrorizing our families is really, really hard. And there are a lot of asylum seekers and refugees who came here from East Africa, from Southeast Asia, because of policies that we have created a welcoming space for them in the state of Washington. But they might have had a capacity of time or money that they didn't get they might have made a mistake as a teenager, and because the path to citizenship was a barrier to them, right? And now we're seeing that happening in our communities, and we have been trying to advocate for that space. So maybe that is somewhere they can support, um, like an immigrant community plan, right? They can, like, whatever is you see in our communities that we need. Another thing that we are seeing as a barrier and issue is food, right? Food is becoming a real scarce resources. So how do we bring hunger intervention programs into our schools? How do we exhibit mutual aid in those spaces? And so maybe, Warlina, that is something like that parent can show up in a different way of maybe I know at Eckstein during pandemic, they had a full-on food pantry and they had different needs like laundry detergent, the different needs. And so go to your social worker, go to your admin and ask what needs might be met or what barriers that can be met. For those of you who may or may not know, there is Alliance for Education has the Right Now Needs funds, and we have a lot of principals that are new to the system. And so that is a way that a lot of families who are expressing barrier needs can ask for help in anything like PTA. We cannot fundraise for the individual, but we can fundraise, we can do a group effort for a class of students. So, for example, it is time for the winter, so there is a coat drive need. So maybe we can also bring in full community together and ask, how do we support kids together, right? And so these are definitely things that I can take on at a different place. I want to acknowledge another question in the chat. Thank you so much for this. I am new to Seattle as a PTA parent and a board member, and I moved from a city/community where there were no PTA dues and all school guardians were by default members of the PTA. It's been so hard for me at times to stomach these money and access issues that are presented here in Seattle. Do other folks have strategies to skirt them? So for me, this is June again. I have to acknowledge that Seattle is an ever-moving space and that we are a boom bust town. That is the history of Seattle. People have come and people have gone. People have come from all over the world and people have stayed. And some people cannot stay because of financial barriers or economic barriers or emotional barriers or trauma to stay in the city of Seattle. And so I want to acknowledge that money is definitely a quick answer that we want to ask for, right? And so money is a tool and a resource. I'm trying to figure out how to say this diplomatically, and that sometimes our wealth can be seen in time, it can be seen in energy, it can be seen in heart, and it can be seen in our values. And that is something that sometimes the DE action plan is also a way to center what is our value? Who is in our community? How do we make sure that all kids feel safe in our space? And for those who don't, what can we do to help? Um, I want to acknowledge the time. It is 12:45. Um, thank you so much. And I would like to talk about volunteerism because that is also part of that. And I am happy to allow in our space Ania, Bestresta, Allison from Seattle Public Schools, who is one person in our central office. I want to acknowledge that. And she has been able to take the time to show up and go through the process and also what has happened in our volunteer process and why it is important and critical as building partners to find the blind spot. I do want to acknowledge that as parents, you may think that you are a wonderful, great person that looks at all children beautifully and visibly, but our children in the schools don't know us. So please wear a badge when you volunteer and show up in the school, because I think it's also knowing that assuming that you are a safe human is not necessarily a space for all of us. And so to acknowledge that we are all volunteers is really, really important. I am going to allow Ania to share. Um, Ania, thank you so much in your busy, busy schedule. I know that volunteering is hot topic at the moment, and so I really wanted to create the space for you.
Thank you, June, so much for inviting me. Is my screen visible?
Let me see. I stopped my
Okay,
share.
I'm getting, good, excellent. I'm getting a lot of thumbs up. Thank you for that. I'm Anya Bashtarda Allison, and I oversee the volunteer program at Seattle Public Schools. I manage the database and train staff who implement volunteer safety in every school. And on the screen right now, you roughly can see my main responsibilities and the volume of our volunteer programming at Seattle Public Schools. We're definitely a very exceptional organization when it comes to volumes of volunteering, just how engaged both families and the community at large wants to be and likes to be in our public schools. So we're really grateful for that support. June asked me to present a little bit about equity in volunteer services at SPS. So I have a few slides on that, and then I'll move on to the new volunteer processes that I know you have questions about. So in my role, one of the things I pay attention to and am constantly reviewing and revising on how the volunteer program can be more and more responsive to it is policy 0030. Volunteerism, right? Volunteers are a resource, and just like any other type of resource, they vary. That resource varies quite a bit from school to school at SPS. In my work, I am in charge of ensuring student safety across all the schools when it comes to volunteer programming. But there are schools at SPS who have more volunteers than students, and there are schools at SPS that have, 100 volunteers for 500 students. So to serve equitably, I also support equity tier 1 and 2 schools with recruitment, volunteer recruitment. And this slide just shows you the distribution of these schools across SPS. So tier 1 and tier 2 schools are the schools I work with closely to recruit primarily volunteer tutors. And in general, all schools are really great at recruiting families to volunteer with them. So my expertise and support is primarily in recruiting community volunteers to tier 1 and tier 2 equity schools. And here's just an example of a handful of tier 4 schools. Those are the schools that are well resourced in a number of areas and also serve students who comparatively to equity tier 1 schools have lower needs in terms of support services or language services, special education services. So you'll see, for example, Rainier Beach being a high school with very few volunteers and compared to Ballard. Those differences are quite large, and this is just a graph that shows you across the system all the schools that are tier 1 equity schools and schools who are equity 4 schools. The ratio of students to volunteers is about 1 to 7 in tier 1 schools and 1 to 3 in tier 4 schools. And again, there's schools on extreme ends where even those ratios are much more pronounced. One scholar whose work I really admire, Anton Chur, has this really cool graphic that I was inspired by to create this representation of kind of how our volunteer program shows up in schools. If the shorter person with a red t-shirt would be our equity 1 equity tier 1 school, they would on average have 150 volunteers supporting the school students in the school and the staff. And then an equity 4 equity tier 4 school, a very well-resourced schools would have about 330. And of course the goal would be for all schools to at minimum have equal number of volunteers supporting students, especially when it comes just to the ratio of students to volunteers. We're nowhere near that. The little bit of capacity that I'm able to spend of my time to recruit for tier 1 and tier 2 schools, would love for it to one day bring us to a place of equality, but the resources we have time-wise are very small for that work, since majority of my time is spent on safety, not recruitment, and of course the justice. A world where we would have just volunteer services and other types of resources in our schools would look very different, where the barriers to the success, student success, would be eliminated entirely. And I loved your conversation about how the Seattle Council PTSA focuses on equity in the work that you do. And here's just examples of the fence that prevents the students from accessing a variety of opportunities. What that fence represents: institutional racism, economic injustice, language barriers, housing instability. All of those things just show up in our schools every single day.
Ania, can I ask one question?
Yes,
Because
go ahead.
this is June. I see a question in this chat. As one of the tier 1 schools, we are really curious on how volunteers are recruited. So,
Yeah, that's a great question. So operationally, what that looks like is that I reach out to teachers in Equity 1 and 2 schools, and I offer them a few different recruitment programs that I have created in partnerships with local colleges, universities, and just online volunteer opportunity search engines like Volunteer Match or United Way. And teachers submit to me their volunteer opportunities, their volunteer needs. I have a template for them to fill out where they share exactly what kind of volunteer support they need, when do they need it, what kind of skills are needed. From that, I'm able to create a volunteer role description and recruit through those channels. And then I introduce the volunteer to the prospective volunteer to the teacher, and they decide whether they're a good fit for their classroom, for their students, and then they get placed, go through the same approval processes as family volunteers. But the difference between community and family volunteers is that they typically, will volunteer more so because they live in the neighborhood, or maybe they work in that neighborhood where the school is, or for a lot of our community volunteers because they really want to be involved where the needs are the greatest. Whereas family volunteers typically will want to be engaged in the schools where their kiddos are. So I work directly with teachers and just give everybody the opportunity to apply for volunteer opportunities, and then volunteers choose among those opportunities. And they have, variety of lenses for that. Some folks are looking for specific experience opportunities. A lot of our community volunteers are aspiring educators, or they're thinking about a career in education, so it's a great way for them to check it out. College students are looking for service learning hours. So retirees are looking to spend their time out of the house and get some social connections in the community. But that's what that process looks like.
Thank you.
Yeah, and here's just examples of how staff access my resources. You might be aware at SPS we have the My SPS website, which is just how departments exchange information internally. And one really important aspect of making our volunteer services more equitable, more culturally competent, of course, is providing learning opportunities. So I do also have a web page dedicated to volunteers being able to learn about SPS values, curriculum that some of our departments have created about specific skills that volunteers, could use practice in, such as conversing about LGBTQ, student needs, or identities. We have training available specifically on anti-racist practices. Some of those trainings are just things we've created in-house, and many of them are through the Seattle Tutoring Coalition that I'm a member of. They are definitely like a great powerhouse for training resources for tutors and volunteers in general working in public school spaces. That's one of the trainings we put together. This one was offered live a couple years ago online. We have another one coming up this fall. It also will be online and then available later on demand. So yeah, so that just to wrap up that part of the presentation, those are some of the ways that equity is front and center in my work as much as my capacity allows. As June mentioned, one person for, at the moment we have more than 20,000 eligible volunteers at SPS, so it's a very large program. And again, my priority always has to be making sure that everybody who applies to volunteer with SPS is screened consistently and is safe to be supporting students in our schools. Moving on to the changes to our volunteer workflow this school year. Jim mentioned that there's a lot of questions from families and PTSA members on that, so I'd be happy to address them. Just first, we'll show you kind of roughly what the volunteer procedures at SPS are based on, and the specific procedural changes that we've introduced this school year. So at SPS, per board policies, let me move this. SPS volunteers are defined as individuals who do not receive any financial reward for the services that they perform. They support SPS staff directly during SPS programming and SPS sponsored programming. So an after school program is not an SPS program. A field trip is, a lunchtime, recess, right? Classroom volunteering, those are all SPS programs, SPS staff provided and supported directed programs. So that's the definition of an SPS volunteer. And unfortunately, over the years, our volunteer program, our screening system has been utilized by a lot of third parties that should never have been using our system. Folks who provide private services, for-profit companies, businesses, vendors, enrichment providers, they essentially have been using our online volunteer system to screen their own employees and volunteers for free, essentially using our infrastructure to the tune of 1,500 a year. So it's been a great strain on the screening system. And that's one of the reasons why we had to introduce some changes this year and essentially no longer allow our volunteer application to be publicly available. June, did you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to add on to that. This is June. Especially as someone who ran our after school enrichment program at our school and looking at all the paperwork, a lot of folks like after school enrichment people, and this is to add on to what you were saying, Ania, is
Yeah.
assuming that SPS is covering our volunteers or the adults who are coming in for these enrichment programs, but that assumption should be on the burden of the PTA because we are leasing that space. We are no longer SPS employees, and so that we are also part of that. So in order for you to protect your PTA and reduce liabilities, there is, and I will put in the chat, the watch program. So for example, if you have a PTA that has enrichment opportunities and there is a parent that is teaching photography, for example, they need to be covered by watch and not the assumption of SPS and their services that they use. And that is to reduce liability upon both parties, and that all of our people, because it is also your insurance, because God forbid something happens after hours, there is a criminal component to it. And so that we should all be very, very conscious and aware of that.
I was hoping to drop something in the chat. Let me know if, I'm not sure if this just went out to Stacy or everybody. The chat I just dropped, did that go to everyone? That's a resource, internal resource that SPS Community Partnerships Office created for PTSAs. If you go to our website, you can look for forms and processes for PTSAs. This website has all the resources as PTSAs need to structure their programming and the infrastructure behind your PTSA-sponsored activities.
Yes, and this is June, and I just wanted to add, I also have some language from Central District that I've been trying to. Once again, I think Penny Marie or Vorlina was asking, like, we are volunteers, and so grace and capacity for all your emails and all your spaces. But yeah, there are. So I have actually language from Central District about paying, um, going further with these forms and processes. So thank you for that reminder, Ania.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I refer schools to that webpage all the time. So, just in terms of why we have the procedures in place that we do for volunteers, they're based on these board policies and these RCWs and WACs, state laws, federal laws, and very importantly, our insurer. So SPS is part of the Washington State Risk Management, Washington Schools Risk Management Pool. It's a pool of over 100 school districts and SPS, and we're self-insured together. How we screen volunteers for, very heavily is influenced by the insurer, because if something does go wrong, we want to be sure to be covered. And if we don't follow the requirements from our insurer, we don't get covered and are responsible um, for paying out claims out of our own pockets. And of course, that's one of the critical reasons behind the work that I do, is to preserve educational funds so they go towards our kids' education, not towards lawyers and settlements and all of that. But more broadly, the number one reason, of course, is to ensure student safety. Um, Clear and consistent and transparent volunteer screening processes accomplish all these goals, but the most important one is that they deter abusers. Youth serving organizations like ours do attract a lot of folks who have ill intent, who want to harm our kids. And if we, together do a good job at having a consistent and a clear and comprehensive screening system for volunteers, those folks are not going to approach our schools. They're going to approach other youth serving organizations, but not our schools. So that's the primary reason behind volunteer screening at SPS. And here's just a quick look at the volumes. Because our volunteers are approved for 2 years, that's based on state laws. If you apply and you're approved, you're good to go for 2 years from your most recent criminal background check. So we roughly have over 20,000 eligible volunteers at SPS right now, but about 10,000, 11,000 volunteer background checks are performed annually, since folks are eligible to volunteer for 2 years. We do both state and national background checks for volunteers, and international, because so many of our families are from variety of countries. So I perform those regularly too. And one really important thing to remember is that our volunteer application is not just about the background check. The background check is just one component. When a school receives your volunteer application, they have a 7-step process to review it in order to be able to approve it. Background check is just one of those 7 steps. The volunteer application is structured so that volunteers need to familiarize themselves with policy 0010, 0030, foundational beliefs, and that's to ensure that folks who, are not on board with the most critical values we have in schools, such as ensuring that all kids are treated not just equally, but that diversity is celebrated, that kids, accents or origins or histories are celebrated and not looked down upon in any way by volunteers. Schools are such diverse environments, and volunteers often come into schools wanting to do good, right? And sometimes with that, there's a lot of traps and a lot of harm that can happen from folks who want to fix the world or, make things better, and imposing their own values and what that looks like and what that means. So our volunteer application is very clearly communicates, what SPS believes in, and therefore, if you're not on board with that, you should not apply. It's a screen of sorts. Volunteers are also required to review FERPA policies, know about what they can and cannot do with students in terms of physical interventions, and if there's behaviors happening, for example, during field trips, if kids are having a hard time regulating themselves. Volunteers are not allowed to use hands, arms, or bodies to control children's behaviors, that they always need to refer to staff in those situations. There's sections on professional boundaries, and very importantly, our volunteer application process includes the Adult Sexual Misconduct Prevention course. It's a 20-minute course in 5 languages, and we do have about 8,000 to 10,000 volunteers completing that course every year. So it's a really, really great education tool because we primarily train volunteers to be not just so that they know how accidentally, maybe not intentionally, would harm students or cross personal boundaries that students want to have, would not want to have crossed, but to also observe and know how to recognize when something is going on that shouldn't be going on, and then very importantly, how to report it. Orlina, did you have a question?
I don't think it's a question. I mean, this is a meeting for equity, correct?
Mhm.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yes, my first few slides were about equity. This one is just about the volunteer
Volunteering.
application process.
No, I understand that, but
Mhm.
overall, this is exactly what kind of what I came in talking about. So I'm just going to be honest.
Yeah.
My community has been oppressed for a long time. With I come from, I'm just going to be honest because this is the approach. This is what I'm seeing. I grew up during the crack epidemic where there were Black people getting arrested for 20 years for addiction and that sort of thing. So we moved past that. I'm saying that to say that I completely understand. I want my kids to be safe and everyone else's kids to be safe. I think it's very important to have the screening, but there are so many barriers. And for me to sit here and listen to what makes people safe and their kids safe, and then also excluding a group of people that have been in a situation for a long time, that are born and raised here and not able to go in and prevent things from happening and support their kids. Like, I feel like my community has been removed completely because being marginalized, where we're not able to operate and do things because of things that have never been set up for us. So I'm going against a little bit, and then maybe even asking. I've brought it up in different spaces as well, where Seattle School District was there and present, where that may be a conversation to look at. We absolutely have to keep our kids safe. So I'm not going against that, but I know a lot of people that are in community that want to volunteer and show up for their kids. Pretty much our people can't show up for our kids because of mistakes that were made. I'll go deeper into it. We're talking about ICE. Well, my people have never recovered from racial profiling and a bunch of different things, survival crimes and that sort of thing. So I'm bringing that here because I hear what you're saying, but I also understand what meeting I'm on, and that's for equity, excuse me. But I'm just bringing it here because I see a major barrier. Like, I'm standing up for other parents that aren't able to go where I can go because I'm able to do that. So at some point we have to consider, okay, how can we include everyone? Even if there's we figure out different ways of doing things, and we still, I mean, like I said, I want to make sure that we keep our kids safe, but this is just kind of hard for me to hear that this group is gonna, you cannot apply, period, because things that you have done that yeah, we all do have choices, but sometimes people don't have a choice, or they may think that that is the choice that they have to survive. So I just kind of want to put that out there. I may be talking to the wrong person, but everywhere I go, I'm going to bring this up because for my community, this is a huge barrier, and our kids are by themselves.
Are you referring to, this is Anya, are you referring to background check processes?
Yes, I am, for the Black community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so having come from the nonprofit sector prior to working at SPS, uh, when I led other volunteer programs, what I would notice there is that essentially folks with any criminal convictions on their background checks would not apply to volunteer at all because they were assuming that they would be turned away from volunteering in your typical nonprofit. And what I see at SPS is, hundreds of folks who do have criminal records apply to volunteer, and just a handful are either restricted in what volunteer roles they can join the school as, or banned entirely. So the chart I'm showing is, and I dropped a link into the chat of this chart. This is our official chart for how we evaluate background checks of volunteers who do have some criminal records. So, you know, it's for both staff and volunteers. The criteria are very similar. Meaning if somebody has committed crimes against children or other vulnerable populations or violent crimes of a certain level, then those are the folks that are prohibited from volunteering at SPS. But um, um, you know, just about everything else, we have a way to welcome that person in, create a volunteer role that's safe for the students and for the schools. So, for example, the most frequent restriction on volunteer role would be that volunteers can't drive students. Some schools utilize a lot of volunteer drivers, but of course, if somebody has like a consistent record of driving unsafely on their background check, we will say, great, you can volunteer in a classroom, but we wouldn't trust you with driving students. So we do have that process in place, and you can check the list of the specific crimes that prohibit folks from being able to volunteer or work with SPS. They're under this link. And, you know, what I just would want to share that based on my experience, having worked in volunteer services for more than 20 years, SPS does have a very progressive process for approving volunteers with past criminal records because 75% of our volunteers are family members of students, and the goal there is to engage those folks in their kids' education or their grandkids or nieces and nephews. So you know, that's how like look back here, you know, of all of these
Can I say something? I'm sorry to interrupt. I think I'm going to say something that's really important. Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So even with the verbiage that we can trust and that sort of thing, it's kind of hard for other communities to come in when that verbiage is being used. Like, we don't trust you if you don't do this. We don't trust you if you don't do that. So I think that's why I'm kind of responding the way I am, is because of the delivery with things. So it's not about just my group of people, but just having an understanding culturally how someone can show up and not feel as if they fit in, and then maybe have someone that looks nothing like them. Life is nothing like theirs, culturally, racially, ethnicity, anything. Sit and use words that can potentially cause harm. I'm going to say something every time. So I don't want to show up and be a stickler, but this is so important with making sure that everyone feels welcomed and everyone feels as if this is a safe place. Everyone feels as if they are trusted, even if they are denied access. I would never want someone to come in and they even apply to be a volunteer and get denied, but straight up be told that we need someone that we can trust. So I'm not going to say anything else, but I had to address that.
Well, Lena, this is June. I really want to thank you so much because sometimes it is part of our work to call out and to figure out where our blind spots are and how we can do better. So, Lena, I really want to thank you for that. And let's talk offline and figure out how we can help community, especially because I'm trying to figure out, especially like expungement, like certain things in the system that we can do
Yes.
to help show how much
Yes.
we care about our full-scale community, because there is a richness and there is wisdom too in knowing how we showed up, how we made mistakes in the past, and how we can continue forward in the future. So thank you.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'll text you my phone number.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. And Anya, again, you know, volunteering is just one of many pathways for family engagement in schools. And it has this specific screening process in place because volunteers work with, you know, are in some situations supervising students other than their own. So they have, in some situations, similar access to students as staff. But family events, community building, PTSA programming, you know, those are all things that are not as structured in terms of clearance processes as volunteering. And, you know, those different types of opportunities exist in every school too. Not to mention a lot of folks, a lot of folks have very blue collar jobs where it's very hard to, take a day off to chaperone your kids' field trip, or it's hard to might be harder for you to do lunch supports or recess supports because your work is just so much more constricted, or it might mean you foregoing an income for that day to volunteer. Um, so again, volunteering is just one of the ways that family engagement happens in schools. So that was a review of why do we have the procedures in place and the policies in place. And to clarify, our volunteer application policy, our board policy on volunteerism has not changed. What's changed this year is the workflow of how I partner with schools to process volunteer applications. So the remaining slides are on that subject. So every year SPS has internal audits where schools, we have an internal audit office that takes on different types of audits to train schools on how to better comply with different requirements, laws, and one of those audits refers to student safety. And so the lessons that we learned from these audits, some of them apply to volunteer processes in schools. And the changes that we rolled out this school year address those audit findings. The most important there are two biggest findings. One is that our volunteers are often approved. Folks are approved as volunteers who are not SPS volunteers. They're either receiving income for the services that they provide while they're in schools, and they should not have been screened under SPS volunteer system. This exposes us to liability if, let's say, if a behavior therapist performs their duties during school hours and harms a student, and they're also they were also an approved volunteer, the SPS is going to be liable for that person, even though that person was just performing their job rather than volunteering for SPS. So that was finding number one. We had over 1,200 volunteer applications last year that were not, at minimum, folks that were easily identifiable as people who either, most of the time, just performed their job duties at school instead of volunteering. And then the other finding from the safety audit was just that schools have a really hard time managing paper sign-in sheets, distinguishing between folks who are SPS volunteers, approved SPS volunteers, and people who are just coming in to visit or meet with a student or a family or a staff member. So these are the three kind of areas of focus we have for this year. In improving safety and volunteer services, clarifying the oversight and supervision of volunteers, who is responsible for volunteers when they're in school. We no longer have, as I mentioned, a publicly available volunteer application link. That link is now provided to volunteers by the educator or staff member who is inviting them to come and support them in some way. And then you might have already noticed we have a new electronic sign-in system in schools. And that system now also includes the volunteer button. I'll get into that in more detail in just a second, but overall, the how we divided the responsibilities for safety in schools when it comes to volunteers accessing the facilities and working with students. This lays out the flow for who does what. We ask school leaders to, decide what kind of volunteer roles they're supportive of in their school. We ask them to appoint a school volunteer liaison. That's the one person in the school building that partners with me on approving volunteers. We asked educators for the first time to be intentional about who they're inviting to assist them, or when they recruit volunteers, the teacher's in charge of handing out that volunteer registration link, whereas before it was publicly available. And this just takes care of private service providers accessing that link. And then we know that every person who accesses that link is in fact an SPS volunteer and who is going to supervise them in that specific role. Nothing has changed for volunteers. Volunteers still apply. They just can't access that publicly available link. They have to get it from a staff member. Volunteers still sign up online. They renew online every 2 years. The background checks are still the same. Instead of a paper sign-in sheet that we had in place up until last year, they use an electronic sign-in sheet. And the school liaisons are now partnering with me a little more closely in that we're only able to provide tech support to volunteers who are going to be utilized by a teacher, are going to be supporting an activity in school within the next 5 to 9 weeks. So that's to just eliminate the backlog of volunteer applications and tech support tickets that we face with one person staffing the program. So school liaisons now use a tech support system, and they also use a new volunteer approval form that lets me know who they're approving to support a school, and then I'm able to transfer those folks into the electronic volunteer sign-in system. So again, all of those are sort of procedural changes and the workflow changes. One, to prevent external providers from accessing our volunteer application system, and two, to make sure that only folks who assist our staff in the very near future are the ones being processed because of the capacity being so limited.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I just want to honor, this is June. I just want to honor a time check. We are at 1:30, and I know this is we're going to get to the meat of some of the questions that people will have. If our interpreters, if anyone needs Somali interpreters, I will keep our Somali interpreter on in the room. But if not, Adan can go if you would like to, and then I will like to hold on to our ASL interpreters, and I will have them bill me for the extra time if they have the capacity. But if you don't, we can address that.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Adan.
Thank you.
David and Selena, I just wanted to check with you as humans that might have a different busy schedule. So I just wanted to check with you guys to honor. Are you okay to stay, or do you have to go? You're okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
My quick question was, in this background screening, not necessarily the screening, but the information that you're asking them, particularly about or letting them know these are the things that volunteers can and cannot do. Does it particularly discuss photography, taking photos, posting photos, um, of students, staff, family at events, field trips, during school, after school events? Does it discuss any of that? And if so, I would love to know exactly where that is, because that is a situation that is going on at our school where I will oh, I'm so sorry, I'm talking too fast. And for I'm speaking for myself. My family and I identify as a confidential family that attends Seattle Public Schools. That is how we're labeled in the system, and so on and so forth. And our pictures are on a unsecure social media post. And I have asked kindly to take it off. And it is through the PTA that it was posted, and it was not a year that I was serving. That's one part of it, as well as there are other families who also would like their pictures not to be posted and not to be used on in any format, but most especially on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is, or someone's personal, field trip post of their own kid and your kid is in the background kind of thing. Um, Also is what's happening. So I'm curious if that's on there because then I would like to directly bring that up with kindness, but yet intensity of the severity of that situation because it is getting, um, I would say it's kind of falling under where it's not my problem. Why would somebody care? Kind of nonchalant, as the kids say, in a nonchalant way. But it is very serious.
This is June.
And
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And if you need support with that, please feel to call me in to help you support that. But it looks like Ania has the language, but FERPA is very, very important. Our children's privacy is very, very important, and so is our family, especially whatever needs or whatever capacities that is at. So yes, it is very, very important. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you. So this is Anya. The volunteer handbook, which I'm showing right now, and I dropped a link into the chat, refers to this. It's one of the commitments that we have volunteers review and sign under when they apply. So it's in the handbook, but it's also the first thing that the volunteers review when they apply to volunteer with SPS. So that's the place you can refer to when you're advocating for your family and the respect for that. But that's a requirement of our volunteers, right? So if you're a volunteer, you sign this agreement that you will not take photos or post them of other children. I know how staff deals with it in the office. It's different for SPS staff, right? But PTSAs would have their own regulations on that. Let me see, just a little bit more on this new flow of things. The one really new item in the volunteer placement process is a volunteer, we call it short volunteer invitation form. It's a volunteer application invitation form. So the teacher fills out a form, they tell us what the volunteer is going to be doing, when, and then when they complete that short form, they get a page that they can copy and paste instructions for the volunteer on exactly what the volunteer needs to do to be approved for that specific volunteer role. So we have different levels of volunteer approval at SPS. And when staff go through the process of using this form, essentially they get the correct information about what this volunteer will need to, the paperwork they will need to complete and what level of background check they'll need to complete. Oh, I already covered this earlier. And then the volunteer sign-in system, we're implementing this right now. Whenever you go to a school that has an electronic sign-in system, you will have those screens to choose from. You can be a visitor, volunteer, staff member, or substitute. Once your school is fully onboarded with this new system, you'll only be able to sign in as a volunteer and receive a volunteer badge if you are in fact an approved volunteer. We're hoping to have that in place by hopefully mid-November. We're importing all the volunteers into this system right now. That's what that system looks like. The volunteer interacts with it. It takes a photo of you so that that photo is then transferred to a badge that's printed for you. Volunteer badges have a dark border, dark black or bright red border around them, and visitor badges are just horizontal, so they're different. Go ahead, June, you have a question?
Oh, this is June. I have a question in the chat. Do you want to go through your standards and then I'll ask, or is that okay to interject right now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. If volunteers were approved previously and are eligible, who is currently approving their application once they are invited by a teacher? Does it go to you at central office or is it the volunteer coordinator at the local school? That was the first part of the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't approve volunteers. I manage all the technology and train people. It's the school volunteer liaisons who actually approve volunteers for every school. They submit the approval form to me so that I can import it into the electronic sign-in system. You'll find them under this link. Every school has at least one volunteer liaison. Those are the folks who review the applications. Now, the capacity challenge is that while there's one or two folks on the school level who process volunteer applications, there's just me on the district level and 20,000 or so active volunteers. So school liaisons do reach out to me if that person needs tech support or if their background check comes back inconclusive. And if you apply and your background check comes back eligible automatically, and that happens when, one, you don't have any criminal records, but also if you have a unique enough name, like me. But if you're a John Smith, it will almost always come back inconclusive because there's other folks who have very similar name and date of birth that I need to review closely and make sure that it's not you. So those are the two times when I get involved with an application, but 80% of the time I don't. It's the school that processes it all in-house based on the information that I feed to them from the database.
And this is June again. The second question is, do volunteers need to do anything if it says that they're eligible? And I believe you said no because nothing changes from that streamlined process from before. Is that correct?
Yeah, the volunteer doesn't. The teacher just needs to submit them into the pipeline for the new workflow.
Okay, and then the third
Yeah.
question is, does the same volunteer need to be approved multiple times at the same school for different events? Lunch volunteer, you might have to go multiple times a week, field trip, club, help,
Right.
etc.
You get approved once every 2 years to volunteer, unless you're going on a longer field trip and you need a national background check. You might need to get approved again. But when you do play different roles in a school setting, each supervisor who is inviting you to assist them with something needs to put you on that log so the volunteer liaison can get back to them that this person is good to go. So you don't need to do anything and you're already approved, but your name is going to be logged into, like, this person is being expected. Let's make sure they're approved because we know they're going to be needed.
So there's no, in terms of, this is June again, in terms of redundancy, like let's say I'm a lunchroom volunteer every Wednesday, I don't have to get an invite link for every Wednesday.
Exactly. You just get it once for the whole year, or probably 2 years. We're still at the beginning of this process for that role. And then
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've just heard discrepancies from different buildings.
Yeah.
And so we just want to help streamline this communication
Yep.
because I know that you're only one person fully serving this
Thank
whole
you.
community.
Yeah. So one invite per volunteer role for, hopefully for the rest of the time that you'll ever play that role. We'll figure that out next year, but just field trips. If you happen to be in a school that has a lot of field trips throughout the year, the educator will have to invite you to every field trip because the invitation email that you'll get has that chaperone guideline form, and that's the form you have to complete for every field trip. But you're already approved volunteer, you just need to complete that form and give it to the teacher. So it's just a reminder for the teachers to take care of that piece. So again, volunteers just get approved once every 2 years. Here's that. You apply once in a lifetime, unless you forget that you applied and you apply again with a different email address. And the volunteer liaison submits your approval once every 2 years. The teachers invite you every time they need you every time they invite you for the first time to assist them with something to make sure that they know that you're approved to be volunteering in that role. So this is kind of the frequency question that I get the most.
So this is
often.
June. Just to clarify the question in the chat, do volunteers have to apply at each school if they have children at different schools?
Great question. Our volunteer application allows you to check all the schools where your children attend. And then each school that you mark on your application has access to your application. Sometimes folks, if your child does move to a different school, they move on to another school, you do need to go back to your application and check that school. So it's up to you to make your application available, viewable to the schools that you'd like to have be available to. but one application for all the schools that your kiddos are at. And that application follows you for the rest of your career as an SPS volunteer. You just need to update the schools that your kiddos are moving on to. Let me see. This was just the process of change that we implemented in September. Schools were okay to use any volunteers that were approved last year. And then now in October, we're shifting to this system where the sign-in kiosk will determine if somebody's approved or not. And schools have been feeding those lists to me throughout October. Principals sent out memos to staff. There were internal communications in staff newsletters, principal newsletters. I did a Q&A for teachers, and I do trainings for school liaisons 3 times a week and office hours. But change sometimes implements, goes slowly through some schools, especially high schools had a harder time adjusting to this change because they were also working on the new lunch schedule. So that kind of, slowed down their adoption of this. So it's still work in progress. And I think as folks work through this, hopefully halfway through the year, we'll have a clearer picture of what these changes really mean, and how they play out in individual schools. This is more specific to school volunteer liaisons, the tools that they use working with me. Yeah, any other questions that come to mind about this new workflow?
I think this is really, really helpful because I think there was a lot of misinformation or a lot of frustration in the community. So I really appreciate your time in this.
Absolutely.
I also wanted to echo one more question that I missed in the chat, and I just wanted you to address it so that we can have it for posterity. I wonder if you can share the barriers of recruiting volunteers at the Tier 1 and 2 schools. For example, I was wondering about the socioeconomic varieties among the parents compared to the Tier 3 and 4 schools.
That's exactly it. It's in Tier 1 and Tier 2, equity Tier 1 and Tier 2 schools, so the highest priority schools for extra supports from the central office. That's really what those tiers mean. That's where families have a lot more blue collar jobs. Folks don't have flexible schedules. They, have a harder time taking time off because it might mean foregoing income, or they have more limited amount of vacation time. So it really is very class-based. The trends among where the Tier 3 and 4 schools are, it's in the wealthiest neighborhoods of Seattle. So it's just it's a consequence of the segregation that we see in a city in terms of housing affordability and where people live. In areas where there's more affordable housing, low income housing, where more migrant communities might be, right? That's where the equity Tier 1, Tier 2 schools tend to be. Someone mentioned the most diverse zip code. Actually, I have a map of, hold on, when I use a map in my recruitments. So I show to volunteers a map of the equity Tier 1 and Tier 2 schools. And if you look at that map, right, it's primarily Southeast Seattle. And a few schools in Central Seattle and the edges of North Seattle where there's some affordable housing pockets. So that's the map I use for recruitment, to instead of having folks choose from all the schools across SPS, this I'm able to present them what's the school with that we're prioritizing that's closest to your workplace or your home. Let me see, I can drop that in the chat too.
I want to acknowledge the time. I would like to thank so much for Pro Bono ASL for staying an extra 15 minutes later for us. I want to thank you, everybody in our full scale community, for showing up and for learning together and how we can share resources, how we can challenge each other, how we can build a community, how we can show and show our different blind spots. I want to thank Anya for showing up, and I know that she is just the power of one and how we as PTA leaders can support ourselves in our community. And we will have this recording available offline. I want to thank you so much, everybody, for showing up on this day. Thank you. Thank you.